Genghis Khan is like your like number one to know about the Mongols. You know, there's a few others of his son and then his grandsons, but he's like, you know, he's the beginning. So he's at first he's not known. He's not born as Genghis Khan. He's born as Temujin, and then also sometimes you see it written as Chinggis. Chinggis and Genghis are kind of the same thing, right? It's like Hanukkah. There's no like correct way to spell it. It's all transliterated from another language, so both are correct. Something about Genghis, as he's like growing up, he's very much developing these tribal alliances. You know, where the Mongols were in Central Asia was very tribal. And so you have these different like small bands, because remember, like foragers in the early human history are nomadic. And so they only live in these small bands because you can only like support so many people with hunting and gathering. So what Genghis Khan did as a kid, as like an early adult, he was starting to form these alliances between the tribes, or defeating some of them that would refuse to align. And so he was really building his power from an early age. And then one of the things he would do is actually like these different appointments, right? So he's not just appointing his family, he would appoint the best person for the job. So if you weren't related, but you were really talented, you could get appointed to be part of, you know, being in charge of some piece of it. So a lot of what he spent time doing is really like gearing up for this massive conquest that took place. He's the one that like really launches the Mongols as this empire of conquest. And at first he goes east and he captures the Jin Empire, which was basically around modern day Beijing. And so that was sort of, first he goes east. That's not necessarily conquering China yet, but it is conquering parts of northern China. And then he goes west. And so by 1227, he had control from all the way from northern China all the way to eastern Persia, right? So modern day like Iraq. So that's a massive, right? So I'm going to show you a map later. I'm sure you've seen this before when we're talking about the Mongols, but it's a massive land territory. It's almost all of Eurasia, and his grandsons will continue it further into Europe. But Genghis is really the like one that gets that. There's always a debate around, is Genghis Khan this hero or is he this villain? You know, one side is that he's ruthless. Like the way that he is conquering people is extremely brutal. Like how there isn't a Netflix special about him, just a series dropping like right now, is shocking. Like there should be, and I'm sure it's coming. But it's just some of the tactics they would use is like psychological, was really like violent, very like Game of Thrones, right? A lot of that makes him seem like just this brutal warrior that was just horrible, right? The like Hitler type person. But then on the other hand, he put together the largest land empire in the world. And to actually argue this point further, let me go to the next slide. So to kind of see his two sides, right? His yin and yang. He's got his like war side, which is seen as that brutal side, and then he has his peace side, right? So like the things he did for the Mongols that were good. And so at war, you know, the Mongols were ferocious. They were great on horses. They had extreme skill with like short bows and arrows that others didn't. And Genghis Khan in particular was extremely efficient in how he organized his soldiers, his troops. And so, you know, they were specifically organized in groups of 10, and then those 10 would be organized in bands of 100, and then those 100s were organized in bands of 1,000. Very, very meticulous in how they were organized and how the communication lines between them went, right? Like those are all like incredibly efficient. I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about the 1200s, you know. Then he would have these other troops that would kind of run ahead and map out the terrain so that as they were planning the attacks, they would have the like, you know, they would be able to surprise everyone else, right? So strategy of surprise, and just craft, just being really strong in what they were doing. So all of these things combined makes him this like great warrior, but also vicious. Like they would just kill everyone if they were not okay with the Mongols being there. Mongols were very much like, if you'll succumb to us being in charge, then you're fine. We'll let you live. But if you have any problem with us being here, like, you're dead, right? Like, that was kind of how it went. On the other hand, the Mongols are this exception in good ways too, which are like, again, like, they really are just sort of, I don't know, this like weird question mark in history because they just don't fit the norms. So even though, like, when you map out the most violent conflicts in all of world history, the most casualties that ever occurred was World War II. The second most was the Mongol conquests. So even though it was a time of just like mass murder just across Eurasia, it also extended this like peace, right? Because as soon as they would conquer a place, as soon as they killed everyone that was against them, then it became really peaceful. You know, they'd go into a city, sack it, loot it, destroy it, and then as soon as they were done killing as many people as they were going to kill, it just like really calmed down. This Pax Mongolica is a really important item. Like, this is something that comes up in multiple choice questions, especially in short answer questions, or that you can use in essays. Because of this piece, you have more trade, right? So like we've told you before, when you have more people, you have more connections between people, right? More trade. So one of the big things that make the Mongols such an exception, like liberally and socially, is because of their religious tolerance, right? So again, we're talking about the 1200s. Religious tolerance was not something that was common in a lot of parts of the world, right? There were a lot of oppressed groups in everywhere, like Jews, like Muslims in different regions, like Buddhists in different regions, right? People, if you were in sort of a minority of a region, then you potentially faced oppression because religious tolerance was not widely practiced. But the Mongols believed in religious tolerance because, to be honest, like, religion was not something that was super important to them. So for them, it was more about just be okay with us being here, and we'll leave you alone. You know, you can pray to whoever you want, you can believe whatever you want, as long as you're cool that we're gonna rule this land. That's pretty much how they felt. So because of that, they have so much more trade. There's the peace is massively important. It just kind of calms things down. So, you know, is Genghis Khan the worst person to ever live? Is he the most ingenious person to ever live? Probably a combination, right? There's like no right answer. I think, as you guys kind of see in the chat, like, you can go back and forth. You could argue either way. Obviously, if you were someone on his path of brutality, you know, obviously from that point of view, he's not so great. If you're someone that was, I don't know, you were successful in his empire, then yeah, I mean, you have to consider point of view, right? This is a much shorter one than usual. The Mongols, even though they come up a lot because they're the exception, and they're definitely like fun to talk about, there really isn't all that much that you need to know about them. Basically, you have 4 Khanates. So remember, you know, a kingdom is called a Khanate for the Mongols. So there's 4 of them. And after Genghis Khan dies, his son Ogedai comes into power. So Ogedai comes into power. He is in charge of like the center of the Mongol Empire is the Chaganate Khanate. It's a whole bunch of words. So the Chaganate Khanate, that's Central Asia. Then you have these other 3, which are led by the grandsons of Genghis Khan, right? The sons of Ogedai. So you have Ogedai that's still running the middle one. That's sort of like the capital city. That's kind of the center point. Then you have the other grandsons that have kind of gone out into different directions. First, you've got the Golden Horde. Okay, so this is, let me show you the map on this. So the Golden Horde, this is, the grandson's name is Batu. You don't need to remember these names. The names that you should know are Genghis, Ogedai would be a good one, and maybe Kublai Khan would be the other one that's here. And I'll talk about him in a second. So the Golden Horde is the yellow one. This is more into Europe, right? It's basically all of Russia. So this is one of the grandsons. He goes, you know, west. He would have gone further into Western Europe, into France, Italy, Germany, and all the way into there. However, Ogedai dies. And so because of that, he's got to go back to the gray. That's where the Chaganate Khanate is, and go to the funeral. So by the time he does that, he sort of lost interest in continuing on over here. But it's still like a massive expansion. And because of their time in Russia, Russia basically like starts to head towards a little bit of like modernizing, like at that point, of their military, because they were not able to stop the Mongols. So clearly something had to change. So then the next one, this would be like Southwest Asia or the Middle East. This is the Ilkhanate. This is Genghis's grandson, Hulagu. So again, you don't need to remember that name, but he's the one that takes over Baghdad. All right, so this is this whole purple side here. Basically, he conquers all this territory and then goes only as far as this point here. All right, so the other one is China, right? So this is the Yuan dynasty. So this is Kublai Khan, and he would be like the one to remember because it's China. It's a massive territory. It's maybe one of the biggest ones, and their influence in China is greater than their influence in any of these other places. So that's why he would be kind of like the guy to know. Here you can see, I mean, look at that, right? So like this green area is all the, the Yuan dynasty is specifically like in China, but all of this territory is part of the like Mongol rule. I mean, it goes just all the way down into Southeast Asia. It's a massive amount of territory. So the one thing that they don't do, they do conquer the Koreas, they conquer China, they do not conquer Japan. And it's kind of fascinating because it's similar to like, if synthesis were still a point on the exam, this was like my favorite one. Because basically the Mongol defeat in Japan is very similar to the Nazi Germans defeat in the Soviet Union in like 42. It comes down to weather, right? Because it gets so cold in Russia that they can't survive that weather. In Japan, it's a typhoon. So it's literally like if this typhoon doesn't happen, the Mongols will conquer Japan. But because the typhoon happens, the Mongols are not able to continue any further, and that's the extent of their expansion in the east.